Good. Okay. So yeah. So thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to talk to you about science and pseudoscience. I am a philosopher, so you're going to get a sort of philosopher's take on this question. And I'm not necessarily going to provide you with a nice, neat answer, but I'll give you some thoughts to take away, so you can make up your own minds about how to distinguish these things. So, so now you just told me how to do this, and I've already forgotten.
It's just there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I just hit that one. Here we go.
Yeah.
Next slide.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So this is what we're going to do. And we'll do everything there. Introduce the question. What is pseudoscience? We'll have a look at the hunt for necessary and sufficient conditions, which is really what we're engaged in, according to a lot of philosophers. We're trying to pin down the necessary and sufficient conditions for pseudoscience. So I'll just explain a little bit about that. We'll have a look at Popper and how Karl Popper famously attempts to distinguish science and pseudoscience. He's the person most people have heard of when it comes to this topic. And then I'll go sort of beyond that and give you some other thoughts too. I'm not going to give you a precise definition. But I am going to explain why I'm not going to give you a precise definition. Okay. So,
can I encourage you to speak up, please?
Yes.
The computer may not be picking up.
Okay. So, what is pseudoscience? I think we can, for the most part, identify it when we see it. You know it when you see it. Look at Feng Shui or phrenology or Christian Science. You immediately recognise that there's something rather flaky about the activities that these people are engaged in. But although we can recognise it when we see it, it's tricky to actually define the term. It is not the same thing as bad science. A scientist who falsifies data in the lab is not a pseudoscientist, they're just a bad scientist or a crap scientist or a dishonest scientist. Pseudoscience is something else, something different from bad science. So what is it exactly? Well, we're asking what is so-and-so, what is pseudoscience? Philosophers typically ask these questions: what is truth? What is the mind? What is science? What is justice? And so on. And it's often assumed that an adequate answer to the question will involve producing a list of what are known as necessary and sufficient conditions. So I'm just going to sort of go off on a bit of a tangent and explain to you what that involves. So some terms we can define in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. So, for example, triangle. Something is a triangle if and only if it is a three straight-sided closed plane figure. So being a three straight-sided closed plane figure is sufficient to qualify something as a triangle, but it's also necessary. If you lack those attributes, then you're not a triangle. Similarly, we can give the necessary and sufficient conditions for someone to be a bachelor. They have to be unmarried and male, for example, or a stallion, a male horse, or a vixen, a female fox. So there are terms for which we can provide this kind of recipe, necessary and sufficient conditions. However, other terms, it becomes much more difficult to provide that kind of an analysis. And very often we find that we attempt to give the definition, and then we run up against counter-examples. So I'm going to give you some examples of that now. Let's take a simple example. What is a chair? You know a chair when you see it, of course, just like you know pseudoscience when you see it. But what are the necessary and sufficient conditions? Well, you could try maybe it's something made for sitting on. Seems quite plausible to begin with, but it doesn't take long for some clever dick to come up with a counterexample. A bicycle saddle is not a chair, but it is made to be sat on. So we've just conjured up an imaginary case, hypothetical case, bicycle saddle, seems to be a straightforward counterexample to our definition. Another counterexample would be a boulder chair, by which I mean a boulder which happens to be chair-shaped by coincidence. And then you stick it in your garden and start using it as a chair. Well, now it's a chair, actually, in your garden, but no one made it or designed it for that purpose. So we have two counterexamples there, one of each kind, actually. So the bicycle saddle shows that being made for sitting on is not sufficient to qualify something as a chair, because bicycle saddles are made to be sat on, but they ain't chairs. Similarly, the boulder chair example shows that it is not a necessary condition either. The boulder chair is a chair, but it wasn't made to be sat on. So it's neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition being made to be sat on. And yet initially the suggestion seemed quite plausible. Here's another suggestion. Something is a chair if and only if it is used for sitting on and has legs. You might come up with that. Again, it's pretty easy to think of counterexamples. The boulder chair immediately springs to mind again, because it doesn't have legs. Bicycle saddle is at least used to be sat on. Swing chairs don't have legs, but they are chairs and so on. So you can see that it's tricky. Coming up with these recipes, often they're quite elusive. It's hard to pin down what the necessary and sufficient conditions are, and that goes for something as familiar as a chair, right? So when it comes to pseudoscience, obviously, it's even more of a challenge to come up with the necessary and sufficient conditions. Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, would go around Athens asking, but what is beauty? What is justice? What is courage? And people would come up with their definitions, and he would shoot them down in exactly the same way. He would provide counterexamples. He would ask the artist, what is beauty? He would ask the judge, what is justice? He would ask the general, what is courage? And in each case, they would come up with their definition, and Socrates would embarrass them by showing that he could think up counterexamples of one sort or the other. And this became so annoying to them that eventually they killed him. He was condemned to death, officially for other reasons, but probably in part down to the fact that he was just really annoying to a lot of very important people. He was embarrassing them.
Too smart for his own good.
Yeah. So we run into similar labyrinths when it comes to defining science and pseudoscience. Just try filling it out. Something is pseudoscience if and only if it is ... It's easy to have a first stab at it, but you soon end up in trouble if you're not very, very clever. IFF, by the way, is short for if and only if. That's just a philosopher's abbreviation. It's tempting to appeal to, for example, the supernatural, and to suggest that supernatural explanations, those are the pseudo-scientific explanations. This is both a necessary and sufficient condition for something to be pseudo-scientific. That won't do, though. Actually, supernatural explanations can be scientifically investigable and testable. And in fact, they are tested. They have been tested. And failed, yeah. So supernatural claims can be perfectly decent scientific claims. They're just, so far as we can tell, false scientific claims. That doesn't make them pseudo-scientific. Secondly, many examples of pseudoscience do not involve the supernatural. Flat earthism, classic example of pseudoscience, nothing supernatural about it. It's not usually. So that doesn't seem to work, appealing to the supernatural. This philosopher, Lao Dan, having been struck by the difficulty that we had in defining pseudoscience, ended up concluding that it was just a sort of hollow phrase. It's a bit like the word weed, in gardening. What are the weeds? What makes something a weed? Well, nothing other than the fact that we don't like it. That's all there is to it. Yeah. It's just a kind of a term of abuse, really, or we're just letting people know how we feel about this plant in our garden. We don't want those and we do want these, but there's no sort of way in which you can define in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions what a weed is, biologically or something like that. It's not going to work. So Laudan came to the conclusion that the word pseudoscience is just a sort of term of abuse, really. There's no real content to it. And that conclusion, he came to that conclusion precisely because he couldn't pin it down in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. There may be other reasons, though, why we can't pin it down. So Wittgenstein, in his latest philosophy, suggests that some concepts are what he calls family resemblance concepts. This is a very useful idea, which you can take away and use in all sorts of contexts. Family resemblance concepts are concepts which work a bit like this. We notice overlapping similarities between a bunch of things, but there need not be one feature that they all share. So, for example, the members of the family, setting aside the fact that they're biologically related, right, they look similar, they kind of hang together. But if you were to try and identify the one feature that they all had in common, the big nose or the red hair or whatever, there needn't be one feature that they all had in common. And yet, they kind of hang together, and you can say, they resemble each other. So family resemblance, then, is a useful concept. Maybe some concepts are like that. And in fact, Wittgenstein famously suggests the concept of game is a family resemblance concept. He says, what is it that all games have in common? Try and pin it down. Do they involve balls? Some do, some don't. Are they competitive? Some are, some aren't. What is the feature shared by all games that makes them games? His response is to say, there isn't one. You don't need one thing that they all share by virtue of which they qualify as so-and-sos. And it may be that this is true of pseudoscience. Maybe the hunt for the one feature that is the defining characteristic that makes them all examples of pseudoscience. Maybe that's just a wild goose chase, philosopher's wild goose chase. In fact, I think Wittgenstein would consider Socrates' project of trying to find the one thing that all the just facts have in common by virtue of which they're just. It's a wild goose chase. Of course, you're never going to find it because it doesn't exist. But that's not to say that justice isn't a perfectly good concept. It is. So you can find this notion quite useful, I think, in a whole range of places. After dinner conversations, what is art? Somebody asks, and 20 minutes are spent trying to pin down what art is. Well, maybe it's a wild goose chase. Maybe it's a family resemblance concept, and there is no one thing that all and only the works of art have in common in virtue of which they are works of art. The art critic Clive Bell famously said, there must be one thing that all visual works of art have in common, or else when we talk of works of art, we gibber, he said. It's pretty much a quotation. Once you've sort of taken on board Wittgenstein's point, you can see that need not be true. So maybe that's true of, I'll skip this bit. Maybe that's true of pseudoscience, and maybe it's a family resemblance concept. So the philosopher Massimo Pigliucci in New York, very good philosopher, probably very well known to the skeptic and secular community, writes on all sorts of things, including the Stoic philosophers. Anyway, he suggests that pseudoscience is probably a family resemblance concept. So it's just a mistake to try and find the one thing that all of the examples of pseudoscience have in common. Popper famously attempts to define pseudoscience or pin it down. Karl Popper, philosopher of science, 20th century, famously got into an altercation with Wittgenstein, in which Wittgenstein threatened Popper with a fire poker. David Edmonds wrote a book about that called Wittgenstein's Poker, if you're interested. Both very important philosophers and thinkers. Popper is what's known as a falsificationist, which is an account of how science progresses. Not many people sign up to that anymore, but still, what he has to say about pseudoscience is kind of interesting, I think, so I'm going to get into that a little bit. So Popper declares that falsifiability is both a necessary and sufficient condition for scientific status. If you've got a claim that can be falsified, it's scientific, or at least empirical. If it can't be falsified, it ain't. And falsifiability means you need to be able to have some evidence against it, such that we can now reasonably rule it out. That would be to falsify it. So he thinks that scientific claims make claims about the world, and in virtue of that, they run the risk of being false.
Yes.
The reality may not be the way it's claimed to be.
Yes.
And we may discover that by engaging in empirical inquiry. If you make a claim that actually has no consequences as far as what you might observe, as far as how the world is concerned, well, it's not a scientific claim at all. It's pseudoscience, or possibly religion or metaphysics, he says. So he thinks that falsifiability is a way to draw the line between statements belonging to the empirical sciences and all other statements, whether they are of a religious, metaphysical character or simply pseudo-scientific. That's how he attempts to draw the line. Tautologies are an obvious example of unfalsifiable propositions. So a tautology is just kind of structurally guaranteed to be true by virtue of the way that it's logically put together. I'm not both a man and not a man, guaranteed to be true. If I say that, I take no risk as far as reality is concerned. So it's not a scientific claim. Either way, I weigh 12 stone or I do not weigh 12 stone. Again, I'm not taking any risks, can't be falsified, not scientific. So these seem to be plausible examples of non-scientific statements. On Popper's view, Marx's theory of history and Freud's psychoanalytic theories of pseudoscience, they seem scientific, but on closer examination, they're unfalsifiable and so not science. So why are they unfalsifiable, these theories? For slightly different reasons. So Popper thinks that Freud's theories were just kind of vague and hard to pin down. So they didn't really have any empirical consequences right from the get-go, because there just wasn't enough clarity in what was being asserted. Whereas Marx's theory of history and how history progresses, he thought that became unfalsifiable because of the certain strategy that the Marxists adopted. So I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. Laudan points out that it's often not the theory that's at fault when it comes to pseudoscience, and this is one of his criticisms of Popper and his demarcation between the scientific and the non-scientific, or the pseudo-scientific. Laudan says, oh no, this is no good. Popper's wrong, because first of all, the theory need not be at fault. In fact, the theory can be straightforwardly falsifiable and indeed falsified. So young Earth creationism, YEC, this is my example, not Laudan's, but young Earth creationism, they are really good at explaining away all the empirical evidence. Their view that the entire universe is less than 10,000 years old. That's what they believe. If you go on one of their websites, you'll see they're amazingly ingenious at explaining away all of the evidence, from the fossil record to the White Cliffs of Dover, to light from distant stars, to all of those craters on the moon. seemingly abundant evidence that the universe is a lot older than 6,000 years, which is their best guess. But no, they are really good at explaining that evidence away. And I would say that it's true that the theory is falsified. It was falsified, but these people just engage in strategies that are designed to kind of bat away the falsifications.
Yeah.
Now, Laudan says that so Popper's wrong then, but I'm not sure this is a good criticism because Popper said exactly this about Marx's theory of history. He said, oh, it was falsified. And then the Marxists decided to just endlessly start displaying away the evidence. What happened was Marx predicted that the revolution would occur in technologically advanced England, but it happened in comparatively backward-arsed Russia. That was not what was predicted by the theory. And in order to deal with that falsification, the Marxists started having to cook up all sorts of excuses and explanations, just like the young Earth creationists. And at that point, then, the theory becomes unfalsified. So it's the strategy, in fact, that was what made it unfalsifiable. And yet Laudan thinks this is a criticism. I'm not sure this is a good criticism, but anyway, that's what he says.
So can I ask a question?
Yes.
It seems that what goes on in the example of the creationist mind is we can make up anything and claim it as a refutation of an old Earth. And so they are prepared to go so far as to say, for example, God made it look old in order to deceive us from the truth that it is really young.
That's not a refutation of it being an old Earth. That's a way of squaring their theory that it's a very young Earth with what appears to be very powerful evidence against that, the fossil record and the dates.
Yes. But how do you address that? Because they're obviously it's a weak.
I'm about to do that.
Okay.
Yeah. So Popper thought that the problem with Freud and Adler's psychoanalytic theories, not Marx, right, but Freud and also Adler, another psychoanalytic theory, he thought that the problem was that they were so vague that whatever happened, you could always say, oh yeah, look, my theories come out as true. There was so much latitude in the theories to begin with that they were just unfalsifiable right from the beginning. But he tells a story about this. He says, as for Adler, I was much impressed by personal experience. Once in 1919, I reported to him a case, so Popper knew Adler, talked to him directly, which to me did not seem particularly Adlerian, but which he found no difficulty in analysing in terms of his theory of inferiority feelings, because that was Adler's, part of Adler's explanation, although he had not even seen the child. So Popper was impressed by this. He thought he had a counterexample to Adler's theory, but Adler, voila, with a bit of ingenuity, he could show, oh no, it does kind of fit after all. So Popper believed the same is true of Freud's theories. They always seem to fit the evidence, and thus be supported by the evidence, no matter what evidence might turn up. And Popper illustrates by considering two situations, one in which a man pushes a child into water with the intention of drowning it, the other of which a man sacrifices himself to save a child. And Popper claimed that each event can easily be explained in either Freudian or Adlerian terms. It doesn't really matter what you observe, they're going to make their theories consistent with available evidence. And so they're unfalsifiable. They're unfalsifiable theories. Indeed, Popper noted he couldn't think of any human behaviour that couldn't be made to fit either theory. It was precisely this fact, that the fact that they always fitted, they were always confirmed, which in the eyes of their admirers constituted the strongest argument in favour of these theories. It began to dawn on me that this apparent strength was in fact their weakness. It was the fact that they could not possibly be falsified.
Yes.
It was actually the problem with these theories. They weren't being confirmed at all. Something else is going on here. But it's interesting that he's talking about fit and confirmation there, and that I think is key. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute.
So too unfalsifiable now comes into the frame.
How do you mean?
Well, they've come up with something which is too far-fetched to be checkable.
Well, it's not far-fetched, but it's necessarily. It's not that it's far-fetched, but it's just sufficiently vague that no matter what happens, you can always say, "Oh yeah, my theory accounts for that. My theory fits the evidence." Yeah.
I couldn't express it better.
So the Marxist theory of history, on the other hand, was falsified, according to Popper. However, instead of accepting the refutations, the followers of Marx reinterpreted both the theory and the evidence in order to make them agree. In this way, they achieved fit. They rescued their theory from refutation, but they did so at the price of adopting a device, a strategy, which made it irrefutable. By this stratagem, they destroyed its much advertised claim to scientific status. So I think this is really also what the problem with young Earth creationism. It's straightforwardly falsified, but boy are they good at cooking up all sorts of defensive, methods of explaining away the evidence. What I particularly like about Popper's work here is that I think he's bang on when it comes to muddling up consistency and confirmation, which is exactly what your question is focused on. He says, I found those of my friends who were admirers of Marx, Freud and Adler were impressed by a number of points common to these theories, and especially by their apparent explanatory power. These theories appear to be able to explain practically everything that happened within the fields to which they refer. The study of any of them seemed to have the effect of an intellectual conversion or revelation, opening your eyes to a new truth hidden from those not yet initiated. Once your eyes were thus opened, you saw confirmed instances everywhere. The world was full of verifications of the theory. Whatever happened always confirmed it. Thus, its truth appeared manifest, and unbelievers were clearly people who did not want to see the manifest truth, who refused to see it, either because it was against their class interests, if they were Marxists, or because of their repressions, which were still unanalysed and crying aloud for treatment, if you were psychoanalytic theories. So I think this is a common feature of pseudoscience. The adherents very often think that anyone that's actually looked into their theory would see that it's just obviously true. And then the puzzle to them is why you can't see it. There must be something wrong with you. You've been got at somehow by them. You're part of the conspiracy. You must be, because you can't see what's lying in the obvious. What I think, in particular, Popper gets right is that he's right to put his finger on the fact that pseudoscientists muddle up consistency with confirmation. And this is a young Earth creationist, Ken Ham, got a great website called Answers in Genesis, and this is a quote from Ken Ham. Increasing numbers of scientists are realizing that when you take the Bible as your basis and build your models of science and history upon it, all the evidence from the living animals and plants, the fossils and the cultures fits. This confirms that the Bible really is the word of God and can be trusted totally. So we're moving from fit, confirmation, to consistency to confirmation, as if they were the same thing.
Yes.
And they're not the same thing. So this is the one thing you definitely want to watch out for, I think, in terms of pseudoscience. This muddling up of the distinction between achieving consistency, which you can, basically any theory, no matter how ludicrous, you can always make it consistent with the evidence if you're sufficiently ingenious at explaining away the evidence and cooking up explanations. That's what Answers in Genesis do. If I believe that dogs are spies from Venus, you might point to the fact that they can't even speak, let alone communicate with Venus. And I start cooking up explanations. But they can speak, but they just keep it secret because obviously they're spies, right? They can communicate with Venus, but we can't find the radio in the dog's bed. It's in his brain. It's embedded in his brain. We've x-rayed the dog's brain. We can't find the radio. it's made out of special alien organic materials. You can just play that game forever. Any theory, no matter how ludicrous, you can always make it fit. That doesn't make it confirmed. Confirmation is something else entirely.
This is the dragon in the garage.
Yes, you can always. Well, I don't know. Tell me about the dragon in the garage.
Well, it's invisible.
Oh yes.
And
yeah.
Even if you put flour down, you can't see its footprints because it's just
yes.
above the ground.
Yeah. It
yeah. And though it's flu wasn't it?
Yeah. Flu's invisible gardener. Right. Yes. Which he borrowed from John Wisdom. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's the same game, basically. So that game, where you try and make your theories fit the evidence, I mean, when I do it with my Dogs of Spice from the planet Venus, you would take that to be indicative of the fact that I've got screws, really. I mean, that suggests something seriously wrong with me. I'm habitually thinking in that kind of way. But that is exactly how young creationists think, and indeed lots of other pseudoscientific folk. I think this is a bit controversial, this is also true of religion pretty generally. The problem of evil is, in my opinion, completely fatal to religion and powerful or good God, but boy, they're very good at cooking explanations for the evil. How are we doing? Oh yeah, another quote. From Ken Ham, in which I think he's exhibiting the fact that Popper is right about this thought that somehow when you get sucked into these belief systems, what's really puzzling to you is when other people can't see that it's obviously true. So Ken Ham says, why can't the humanists and the evolutionists see that all of the evidence supports exactly what the Bible says? It is because they do not want to see it. It is not because the evidence is not there. They refuse to allow the evidence to be correctly interpreted in the light of biblical teaching. So I think Ken Ham nicely illustrates Popper's point there, that you end up puzzled. Why can't other people see that this is true? There must be part of the conspiracy. So I think that Popper gets certain things right. Oops. Well, that's not showing properly. But let's move on to the next one quickly. One last point I'll make before I stop then. Sometimes people link pseudoscience and bullshit, possibly helpfully. So what is bullshit? Well, a philosopher called Harry Frankfurt wrote a book, it's very thick, called On Bullshit a few years ago. Became a little minor classic of philosophy. And in that book, Harry Frankfurt defines the bullshitter as someone who is unconcerned with the truth of what they claim. So they're not liars, because liars know what the truth is, and they're concerned about the truth, and in particular they're concerned that you not believe it.
Deliberately misrepresenting it.
Yes. The bullshitter, on the other hand, just couldn't care less one way or the other, whether it's true or not. So bullshitters are different to liars, says Frankfurt. He says,
I know somebody who wrote a book on bullshit apart from him?
Yes, I also wrote a book on bullshit, but I don't agree with this definition of bullshit. But anyway, let's not get into that. So the bullshitter, says Frankfurt, is neither on the side of the true nor on the side of the false. His eye is not on the facts at all, as the eyes of the honest man and of the liar are, except insofar as they may be pertinent to his interest in getting away with what he says.
But isn't there a phenomenon that lies is often come to believe the lies? So it's...
They can do, yes. Yeah. Anyway, the key point is bullshitters just don't care. Can you think of anyone that might be fit that description?
Johnson.
Yeah, Boris Johnson, yeah.
Or across the Atlantic as well.
Oh, across the Atlantic.
Well, I'm right wing, so I don't agree.
Yeah.
Well, the Trump thing, I can't altogether disagree, but
Don't forget, we're not political, Jeffrey.
Yes, here's a classic illustration. In The Art of the Deal, Donald Trump's book. Trump claimed that the decorative tiles in the children's room at his Mar-a-Lago resort were made by Walt Disney personally. When Trump's butler asked him if that was really true, Trump replied, "Who cares?" I mean, it wasn't a lie. He wasn't really sure whether it was true or not. He just didn't care. He just said it for effect.
In fact, there's a very recent example of that, because he claimed, he made a speech in which he said that nobody was attending, hardly anybody was attending Kamala Harris's meetings. And then the next day he was interviewed and asked for the evidence of the actual size of the crowd. And he said, "I don't know."
Yeah.
So
is it true or is it false? Who cares?
The argument that he was before he became a politician. And
it was, yes.
I was very critical of politicians.
Yes. Yeah. So now you could, excuse all the text on the slide, but you could, and James Ladyman, another philosopher of science, does suggest that pseudoscience is a bit like bullshit in effect. He says, pseudoscience is to science fraud as bullshit is to lies. So the science fraudster is deliberately fabricating, knowingly misrepresenting reality. Whereas the pseudoscientist is kind of indifferent to whether it's true or false. They don't really care about whether it's true or false. So they're kind of like bullshitters within the realm of science. And that's James Ladyman's suggestion. James Ladyman, I mean, there's an obvious worry about that, which is that very often these people do seem to be seeking the truth. They seem to be concerned with it, but Ladyman says, no, not really. If you actually really look at what they're doing there, they're kind of deceiving themselves. They're not really concerned with the truth. They just are trying to convince themselves that they are. I personally don't think that's a good account of pseudoscience, because very often people who believe in pseudoscience do care passionately about whether or not what they do believe is true, and they bet their lives and the lives of their own children on it. And I can't see any way in which you can maintain the view that they don't really care about the truth if they're prepared to bet their child's life on it. So I'm not convinced by that way of characterising pseudoscience. So far as I'm concerned, I think that the best way of thinking about pseudoscience, and this is very rough, but it's basically employing methods that appear to be scientific, that ape the methods of science, but on closer examination, they're not really scientific at all. And
there are kind of degrees of pseudoscience.
There are.
Complicated.
That does, yeah. So you can. The explaining away strategy adopted by young Earth creationists, I mean, there it's just habitual. But, even genuine scientists do it a bit. If I boil water and take the temperature and it's not boiling at 100 degrees centigrade, but it is when oh my God, I falsified my theory. Now, what you're likely to say is, there must be something wrong with the thermometer, or there must be the air pressure is not what I thought it was, or you start explaining away. But it's not that long before eventually you're going to, for a decent scientist, you're going to go, no, actually, something's wrong. A certain amount of explaining away is legitimate, but when it's just habitual, like in young Earth creationism or Marxism, then it's pseudoscience. You're absolutely right. It's going to be a matter of degree.
And there's your book.
Yeah, so in the book I identify various warning signs of bullshit, and indeed, but it fits, I call it, that is muddling up consistency and confirmation. Trying to show that your theory is consistent with the evidence, by hook or by crook, is not the same as showing that your theory is confirmed by the evidence. A completely different thing. And then another thing that they typically do is they pile up anecdotal evidence. So Christian Science, so-called, if you're familiar with it, the Christian Science reading room in Oxford. Christian Science, why is it science? But it's faith healing, is what it is. But they call it science because they've got a really big book, in effect, of all of the cases where people have been prayed for and they got better. And they compile all of these cases and they go, voila, the evidence. It's science. But of course, that's just a pile of anecdotes.
Selective.
First of all, it's highly selective because they've only chosen the cases where there was a miraculous recovery, not the cases where there wasn't. They're also overlooking the fact that people get better anyway. So, how many of these cases would have happened anyway? Maybe all of them. And then also you're relying on testimony from people who have a lot invested in this belief system. That's not good evidence. But it can be made to look like science, and that is exactly why they call Christian Science science. It's pseudo-science, but it looks sufficiently like the real thing that they at least convince themselves that that's what they're doing.
And they can convince people who don't know any better.
Yeah. So there's a quick summary for you. Trying to define pseudoscience, it is difficult to do, certainly in terms of pinning down necessary and sufficient conditions. Does our inability to pin it down in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, so it's just an empty phrase? I don't think so. Possibly it's a family resemblance concept. We've looked at Popper's account of pseudoscience. I think there's something of value in there. We did look at some objections to Popper's account. We looked at pseudoscience and whether it's a kind of bullshit. I don't think it is, personally, but make up your own minds. So what I've given you is finally a sort of rough and ready outline of what pseudoscience is, which is basically the aping the methods of science.
Yeah, so I'm quite respectful.
Yeah.
Can I challenge in 3 ways? Is the first one promotes me enormously because of all the things I dislike, Wittgenstein and Plato, Socrates, and linguistic philosophy, because as language, I think, is just not precise, and there's no use drawing out the truth out of language when it is another means of communication between humans.
Well, that's kind of Wittgenstein's point, really, is that you're looking for a very precise definition of the sort you get for triangle within mathematics. You're looking for that kind of definition. When it comes to ordinary everyday concepts, and ordinary everyday concepts are just much messier than that, they're much more organic. And trying to impose some rigid mathematical crystalline grid upon ordinary language is just going to result
in some more than others. Courage is probably definable if careful enough. Justice is, by contrast, as has the between 2 poles that of mercy and everybody getting their just desserts, which are different concepts within the word justice. Okay, so that makes it almost, if not completely, undefinable.
Well, ordinary everyday. Wittgenstein would say ordinary everyday language is perfectly. There's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly serviceable. We all know what a game is. We all know what a chair is. These are perfectly decent concepts. Just don't impose ludicrous standards on ordinary language, because that's going to generate philosophical confusion. So I think that's probably right. Yeah.
I bet there are some philosophers who disagree with you.
Of course, yeah. And in fact, there was even, if you're interested, there's a book by a man called Bernard Suits called There's Something in the Grasshopper. I can't remember what it is. In which he offers the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a game. So I'll leave you with that, if you like. So the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a game are that it involves, roughly, the overcoming of unnecessary obstacles, which is pretty good. Because if you think about it, football, the aim is to get the ball in the back of the net repeatedly, but you can only use your feet, and you're not allowed to go offside. And
the other team.
Yeah, exactly. So you introduce unnecessary obstacles, and then you overcome them. Or playing solitaire, you need to get the cards lined up in a particular way, but you're only allowed to do it in a very restricted way. You set up obstacles for yourself and then you overcome them. So that was Bernard Suits' definition of a game. I'll let you.
The second of my challenges when you talk about the argument from evil. Part of this book, one of the arguments they use is that it does need to be tightened up, because they get away with a lot as long as the world is sort of overall somehow good. It's enough for them. the point is, God is the best possible creature. They would make the best possible world. And I say that, and then it becomes easier to say this isn't the best possible world, rather than just a balanced, really good.
Yeah, I don't think what you're saying contradicts anything I said.
I thought it's tightened.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I've published a lot of work on the problem, so I'm quite
Can
familiar with it.
Okay.
Can I have a couple of comments?
Yes.
First of all, I ought to apologise because I sort of assumed that Stephen's fame would have preceded him and that you all knew that his track record and his CV and everything. But what I should have said when I introduced him is, this is the Stephen Law who was a reader at Haythorpe
Yes, yeah, well, yeah.
College until they closed it down.
Yeah.
And this is the Stephen Law who has written, I don't know how many books.
10-ish.
Yeah, he can't remember how many. and this is the Stephen Law who is the editor of Think! Exclamation mark.
No exclamation mark, actually. Well, yeah, Journal of the Royal Institute of Philosophy.
Yes, yes. And this is the Stephen Law who's currently I don't know, I'm not going to get your title right, but you're involved in further education from the university.
Oxford University Department of Continuing Education, yeah. And I was a research fellow before London and Oxford. But originally I was a postman.
Yes. Well, as I disagree with Plato, so I'm going to stop me from disagreeing with it.
Yes.
With you.
I've never said that before, it's very good.
What perhaps is most relevant is that there is an area where science becomes, at least at this moment, unable to verify or not verify. And that, for instance, is in the afterlife. The religious people say you have a soul that goes to heaven or hell.
Yes.
Now that is, well, it potentially, I suppose, is discoverable. You might discover a soul someday.
Yes.
That could not my present thing. They might discover heaven or hell, but it is beyond the reach of science.
Yes.
And it becomes very much at the borderline of how they're important between in what's could be called pseudoscience and what's just beyond present science. And that's an important region in the religious argument. Mm-hmm. And I don't believe in an afterlife, but I don't think it's absolutely disprovable.
Well, it's claimed but not proven.
Yeah.
No, I think you can establish beyond reasonable doubt that there isn't one.
Well,
do it? I'll do it.
Well, I'll put it this way. What makes me hesitate to agree with you 100% on the balance, and that I do agree that unprovable.
By the way, philosophers hate the word. Because it's ambiguous.
Assuming that I was more aware than I am or anybody that is. When you're sort of a fetus in the womb, you wouldn't really believe there's a world outside the womb which you just go into, because that's beyond all experience. It's something which would seem more than improbable from that settled world there. So,
well, you simply have no clue when you're. You have no clue.
Well, I'm assuming if you had clue, you wouldn't readily believe there's a world beyond the world you know, of a different kind.
Probably not, no. But
and that's what makes me a little bit hesitant to say.
Yes. Well, I think
there's a further world beyond.
I think your hesitancy is misguided, because we should show humility. But theorists love to go on about how we all need to be humble and acknowledge that there are more things in heaven and earth than that's of in your philosophy, or whatever it is. So yeah, so it sums up to that then. Probably there are things that are beyond our comprehension and so on. But then they try and use that as a protective screen, which then makes certain things off limits to scientific investigation or reason. And, you know, maybe there are some things back there that are beyond our ability to detect them. But that doesn't mean that you cannot establish conclusively that that certain things are not behind the screen. You can establish conclusively, for example, that there's no all-powerful and supremely malevolent deity behind the screen, because you look at what's on this side of the screen, it's too good.
Yeah,
Right? This is conclusive evidence.
That's a logic, but I'm not sure that the afterlife is entirely within the can be disproved by logic. I think I believe it on a heavy balance.
No, that was empirical evidence. The quantity of good is more than sufficient to establish the non-existence of any kind of supremely powerful and malevolent deity behind the screen. Things may be hidden, but that doesn't mean that you can't conclusively, or pretty conclusively, falsify or confirm them. That's exactly. I mean, this is exactly what's said about the supernatural. It's off limits. No, it's not. Supernatural claims have empirically observable consequences. If petitionary prayer works, we can test it.
Yes.
We did, and it doesn't.
Yes.
There's all separate issues. I mean, the Buddhists the Hindus say, well, there's a soul with somehow being light.
There's good empirical evidence. There's good empirical evidence that your mentality is a product of what's going on in your brain, and that material causes, physical causes have sort of effects, have physical causes. And once you've accepted that, and I think we have no option but to do that, then the souls become ridiculous.
I mean, the effect of heaven and hell would be a lot better if there was unequivocal proof that it existed, then we would all know where we're going.
Yeah.
Except we should never know anything to say.
No, not for certain, but that doesn't mean you can't know anything. I mean, that's why I hate the word proof.
Me too.
Yeah, so the word proof can mean proof beyond all possible doubt. Well, you can't prove, maybe that you exist, according to Descartes, I think therefore I am, therefore I can prove that maybe that. But the vast majority of claims about the external world you won't be able to prove. But then there's also proof in a court of law is proof beyond reasonable doubt. Proof beyond reasonable doubt, well, we can get that, and we do regularly because we lock people up.
But it is contrary to logic. It's a different category in a square circle or whatever. You say it doesn't mean it's contrary to logic. It's a different category to whether there's some collective sphere out beyond observation.
Yeah, well, there are two ways you can establish things don't exist. One is empirically.
Yeah.
The other is by showing there's some kind of logical contradiction.
Yeah.
Not a great idea.
And the logical contradiction is more powerful than empirical.
Yes.
I think I'm giving you too much crack of the whip here.
Yeah.
Can some of the
I
rest.
disappeared off the.
So I wanted, when you were doing the demarcation bit,
Yes.
made me think of statistics.
I don't know anything about that.
Oh, right. Okay.
Tell me about that.
Well, it's from taxonomy, because
Right. Yes.
for a long while, taxonomy was about looking for similarities, with the forlorn hope that you might find single identifying characteristics into which you could class things.
Yeah.
But more recently, thanks to, I think, not Hugh, but the other guy, the probability guy,
Phase.
yeah. So and computers, we've tended to look for distinctions rather than similarities. So divisions between where things branch off rather than instead of putting them together, overlooking these differences. With statistics, you get lots of degrees as a result of looking for these. Oh, that's not the same as that.
I don't know how this is related to it.
Well, I'm just wondering whether it's you talking about demarcation. Made me think of that. I wonder if there's actually any parallel there in the process.
Maybe. I mean, you could see how certain weird systems of classification could be pseudo-scientific. Definitely. Because I don't know enough about that example.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say about it.
another time. Maybe.
What I guess I'm interested is what makes someone's mind work in a pseudo-scientific way,
Yeah.
as opposed to a more rational scientific way. Because
Yeah.
I think it's the key to. I mean, it's staggering in this day and age. There are so many people now. Either some people are just deniers, simply because that suits them. But presumably some people genuinely do believe it. And then of course they're the outright bullshitters. And what frightens me about, obviously, in relation to religion is that, you know, I've got a lot of sympathy for people who are culturally religious. You know, it just goes on. That's what we've all done. Dawkins.
I'm getting really cheesed up with them. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You just go along.
Well, the motivation seems to be, sorry, I'm interrupting, but the motivation very often seems to be that there's this concern with Islam and that we need to get Christianity in the mix in order to fend off the Islamic hordes.
Yeah.
I said, I don't buy into that personally, but anyway, look, where are you going with the?
Well, only you know, then you've got the people who supposedly have studied, you know, the texts, you know, theological college or whatever, and they have either totally bought into the bullshit,
Yes,
or it's just a business.
Yes.
It just gives them a lifestyle.
yeah,
I mean, and then in which case they are just frauds.
Yeah, I think you get both.
This is where I almost lose the plot, I think.
yeah. Well, see, I'm a philosopher, so that means basically I'm a sort of an arm. I'm interested in what you can establish from the comfort of your armchair, which is quite a lot actually. But what I don't have expertise in providing psychological explanations for why people have certain vulnerabilities and so on. Having said that, I know a little bit about the psychology. I mean, on one classic explanation would be cognitive dissonance. So Festinger, who came up with this idea, famously wrote a book called When Prophecy Fails, in which he investigated a little cult, who believed that the world was going to end, that a flying saucer was going to show up and rescue him just before the world ended. And so they all sat around waiting, clock ticking, on the appointed hour, and nothing happened. Okay, and so how did they respond? Well, Festinger discovered that they went on a recruitment drive. And they tried to bring more people in, I think with some success, more people into the cult. They didn't abandon their belief, they just doubled down on it and tried to bring more people in. Why did they try and bring more people in? Well, according to Festinger, because that provided them a reassurance that it couldn't be quite the bullshit that it seems to be. More generally, more generally, if you've invested a lot in a particular belief, I mean, if I believe that shamanism near the Matterhorn, and somebody says, no, you've got that history, I'll go, oh, yes, okay. You'll change your belief, it's easy. But if you've invested a great deal in a belief, it becomes progressively more difficult to give it up. So if you've spent your entire career advertising cigarettes and somebody comes up with evidence that it causes lung cancer, you're going to improve resistance to that. If you've spent your life living with your wife and then somebody points out that there's evidence she's a serial killer, you're going to be extremely sceptical and find all sorts of ways to explain the evidence away, just like Ted Bundy's wife did. If you have invested an awful lot in a religious belief, and people often do, a lot financially, socially, their entire career potentially. If you're presented with evidence contrary that threatens, boy, that's very difficult. It's going to be very, very difficult for you. Or political beliefs. If you have invested a lot in political beliefs, and often you have, if somebody presents you with evidence that actually you've made a serious mistake, you're going to find ways to explained away. So just go on social media and look at people that are from the left or from the right who have their views challenged. Evidentially, they're just doing the same stuff. They're just explaining away the evidence because they've invested so much in it. It's costly, emotionally very costly, socially costly, change your beliefs. So I think that's part of it. But I mean, it's not the whole explanation, but it's part of it.
I have a small piece of pseudoscience presented today the other night from the Quran. And it's this bit about Sirius and the Earth and the distance between. And if you read the Quran, there are 861 words between Sirius and the Earth. And if you look at the light year distance, it's 8.61 light years. Exactly, it's fine.
Yeah.
And when I was young, it was 4 light years. But the point is that the astronomical science has changed.
The nearest star is 4.31.
Yes, and it was the other way around.
Yeah.
Sirius was in the nearest.
Yeah.
I mean,
Like the Bible code. That was the original.
Yeah.
Well, there used to be a Bowles law for astronomy, the distance of the planets in astronomical units. And that carried on for 100 years or more. So it was rubbish. But it did lead to the discovery of Pluto.
But more recently, the Hubble telescope, they found galaxies older than the world was then supposed to be. So it's got from 8 billion to 14 billion years.
Scientifically embarrassing right now.
So,
So my computer's going to run out of space in a minute, so I'm thinking that maybe we should bring this.
Yes, no, I've got to go shopping. So,
Right. Well, what do we think?
pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.